Okay, the only. I'll call to order this committee of the whole 241 for March 28th, and in honor of the Leeward Tool, the Village of Pemberton acknowledges that we are meeting within the unceded territory of the Leeward Nation. Those members of the public in attendance, please note that this meeting is a live webinar and is being recorded. A recording of the meeting will be available on the village's website following the meeting. Any amendments to the agenda? None. Move is presented. Mr. Caddick, seconded by Mr. Ramsden. Any opposed? Motion carries. Adoption of minutes from Committee of the Whole 240 from March 14th. Moved by Councillor Ramsden, seconded by Councillor Nightingale. Any opposed? Motion carries. Right to the main event, 4.1 of the 2023 Budget Information Review. Mr. Sikora.
Thank you very much for having me today. I brought a couple of different packages for everyone's review. I believe that in advance, everyone will have had a chance to review the 110-page agenda. I tried to be easy on everyone. There's only 17 pages of finance stuff, but I want to supplement it with a PowerPoint that I've brought up on the screen today too. Really, I would highlight a couple of things, and I'll go through the notes so that everyone's up to speed on the. So make sure it works. Yeah, I want to make sure everyone's up to speed with some of the assumptions that are embedded in today's session, but really importantly, take the opportunity to ask everyone to think about today like a working session. Really, what I'd like to ask for everyone to start with is to provide feedback and direction on the budget. So today's the first time that this group collectively is looking at the operating budget. We've already looked at the capital budget. We've looked at the strategic direction, and I've tried to translate those into a robust operating budget that follows some of the mandates around service and cost efficiency and accountability that I talked about in a few of these sessions. But as we go through a little bit more of this detail and in the departmental review, please provide some feedback and direction, because I can incorporate that for the next sessions. Next time, just so everyone's aware of the roadmap, I'd like to present potential tax implications, some scenarios, as well as some reserve discussions. We'll have an opportunity to discuss with a few more granular details around the COVID recovery grant and gas tax and some of the stuff that funds the projects too. But today we're looking at the biggest share of the budget, get some direction and translate that into feedback. The schedule allows for a little bit of flexibility with that if we need to, and hopefully everyone's available on those dates we marked. We need to spend a little more time exploring some of these concepts. That's why we built the structure of the timeline as we did. And then really importantly, I always ask for public feedback too. I was really pleased to see we did get some this time. There was only one email we followed up and not heard any direct feedback, but we asked people to tune in and listen to these sessions and communicate with us if anything comes up, or through council direct to staff and feedback as well. So I think that's most of the housekeeping before I kind of get into the report and the details. But any questions before I take that? Great. I can keep the next slide up as I talk through, because I think it's good that we kind of informed. Thank you. There are calls for feedback. Great. No difference. Oh, that's fine. So I would highlight a couple of key assumptions before going into the details of the budgets. On the finance calendar, we have a year end that finishes up on the calendar year, the fiscal and year end line up with the calendar. But it takes a while to close and collect all the invoices, make payment, reconcile the accounts before we go into the audit. So everything that you're gonna see today, like always in these preliminary discussions, is unaudited and preliminary and subject to change. Meaning, please don't get too hung up on some of the final conclusions that we put at the end of this document. We bring those when we talk about taxes in a little more defined and dialed capacity once we've incorporated this feedback. So it's in progress. The team's working hard and going through that, and they're on audit again. The 2023 operating budgets, these, as we've talked about, are budgets that we've developed with our departmental managers. So everyone's taken the time to provide feedback, and in a few cases, we have made some significant changes between the various accounts. So you might see, like in public works, that we see maintenance expenses go down, but some of the servicing costs go up. We're making sure that we're providing managers the right tools to really manage their budgets. I'll talk about some of those details, but again, because we've looked at it with a lens of a bottom-up build as opposed to a top-down, there are some changes that that surface because of that. Yeah, tax implications and recommendations for those will be presented at the next session, and reserve implications as well. So we have a few placeholders, but we'll really define those and work through the mechanics of that next time. And I did include a non-market change adjustment. This is the result of the BC assessment completed roll. We will see the revised roll coming out in and around April. So the assessors take some time to review in February and March, and we get to go through the calculations and exercise all over. We did see some significant change in Pemberton, so there is some risk to that roll. The risk to roll meaning it might go down. So right now we do have that per the assessors at 152,000. A simple way, or perhaps an oversimplified way to highlight that, is the new growth and any changes to the property classes make that increase up. So you may think about it in some ways as new houses are built and there's some new tax base that's brought online, and we need to support that proportionally. So again, oversimplified, but we see that as a factor, and we'll chat about that in a little more depth with the revisions next time. In this budget also, you're seeing assumptions around no increase for collections to other governments. So as we think about that third of the pie that we discussed last time, we kept that flat for the purpose of assumptions today. We haven't got all those numbers from all of the partners that help us with that. Transit is budgeted using the BC Transit estimated revenue and expenses from the annual service agreement, annual operating agreement, AOA. There's an allocation for administration salaries that we see here, expense to the general fund and reclass to water, sewer, and airport. That's their proportion of 24, 22, and 3% respectively. Public works and parks are not reclassed, but they're based on an hourly rate, so we can see that in the individual budgets. Salary assumptions provide what we have here. We're provided recommendations from WCBC, and I've reflected the assumptions to the 2022 guidance that they've provided, and then provided an estimate of market change for 2023 at 4%. I'll talk about that in a bit. And also we have some salary assumptions around full staffing levels included as well. Collective agreement assumptions are embedded as well. I'll talk about that in a bit. And some CPI assumptions for council as well, with some reference to bylaw 704 is included. Also, we previously talked about capital projects, and I think on page 17 of the appendix, I've updated some of the requested assumptions around funding, so we can talk about that as well. And then importantly, water and sewer capital projects are fully funded through user fees, reserves, or grants, and don't have additional tax implications. And a couple of reserve assumptions have been added as placeholders, but we'll iron that out next time. And as presented, the operating budget is shown at a deficit of 159,000 with an offset unaudited surplus carry forward of 275,000, all which nets to a $21,000 overall surplus. So again, year ends in progress, and all figures are unaudited and will change. Order of magnitude, 1% tax increase is worth about 20,500 at this stage. And that'll be revised with the revised rule. A little more housekeeping. We still have the COVID-19 Safe Restart Grant funding available. We'll discuss those details next time. But the current balance is just over $550,000 remaining. We can talk about some of the allocation assumptions there, along with gas tax, which after the ambitious project list has a remaining balance of $317,000, but that was a $697,000 project list, of which much is carried forward into this year. So we'll share those updates next time. A lot of housekeeping, a lot of details. Is there anything that I should stop and take questions before I go into the slide? I'll bring it back up so that it's simple and then bring it back down to the details. That's good. Okay. So just so everyone's aware of what I've organized today, so that we're not jumping ahead or missing stuff that could come up in questions. Really quickly, I'll highlight again the major themes that we used to ground the budget. I talked a little bit about purpose, but I'll hit on 2 points again. Talk about general collections and market, and then specifics for the departments. Really the highlights in areas where I really want to address with some attention and get the feedback from everyone. And then if we need, there's a big appendix with all the details which align with what you have in your package. And then I've included, in case we want to look at them, some of the service objectives just to help define or reground some of the questions as well. And as always, we ask people to share any feedback, so I've included that as well. Sometimes I find it's easier to share this so that we know where we can jump to if we have to answer any specific questions. Okay. I highlight the goals again, and go through feedback and direction today, please. And tax and reserves will happen next time. This is a summary as well of what I just discussed in the report. If it's all right, I'll proceed unless there's any questions. So as a reminder, this is where we're looking at revenue and taxes and collections. There's various sources of funding, but the departments outlined here, which we've chatted about before, along with projects and reserves are included. So we'll walk through all of these departmental budgets today and really paint a little more detailed picture of where we are. As a reminder, we often look at the impact of inflation as measured through the British Columbia Consumer Price Index. It's a basket of goods, so not directly representative to exactly what we do, but unadjusted year over year in December 22, it was 6.6% higher. So relative to typical increases of less than 2%, it's been a very significant increase, and we've seen a lot of that in Pemberton. Again, as we've chatted about before, some of the assumptions today that we'll look at reflect that we are seeing additional charges, and a lot of that's amplified by geography, but through the bottoms up process, a lot of our departmental managers have really tried to drive down and look at areas to save and be more efficient with the funding, and whether that's through new bids or tenders or looking at activity driven reporting and maintenance programs, so forth. We've tried to manage around some of that. That said, we're also exposed with a lot of aging infrastructure and the demands that a community that had a lot of stuff built in the 1980s is showing. So when we talk about reserves next time as well, is thinking about some of the maintenance today. We're seeing the demand, but we're also needing to plan for the future, and we had that presentation a couple sessions back from our Your City consultants that recommended that we invest a little bit more to support that. Again, a large, I suppose, theme this year and challenge that we've seen over the last number of years that we're trying to address in this year's budget is the turnover and staffing challenges that we've seen. So with 25% and 35% turnover over the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of expenses to support finding new people. And through some of the proposed initiatives in this budget, we're very hopeful to see more stability measured through retention and growth of people that are in the organization. I think that's a major theme, and being both following the recommendations or proposing recommendations of the consultants and looking at their independent expertise to recommend some changes to our remuneration. Today, we're also looking to incorporate some of their feedback from it competitive going forward with the market. And this year, that's estimated at 4% to remain competitive. We're also going to include some assumptions that you'll see in the budgets around targeted investment in training and development and succession planning. So with a lot of new staff, there's higher demands in the early years of their new roles and the organization and potentially in their roles specifically. That's reflected through our training expenses. A caveat there, we're coming out of COVID and a lot more requirements are in person. So kind of restoring those budgets back to where they were before people were taking training from their living rooms or offices. So administration and financial services budget along with governance. I put the two on the same slide, and those following along, I think it's page 6, 7, and 8. So embedded in the assumption is that we've got full staffing, but reflected in this, the merit increases and updated grid, along with the investment to support training resulting from this higher turnover. If you do look at training GLs around the organization, what we did with great support of our excellent HR advisor, is we reviewed needs assessment for the next several years and really defined what that trajectory and investment would look like, and where appropriate, we targeted what's today, priority, tomorrow, and going forward. So that's been reflected and prioritized throughout the organization. What we do see is some specific requirements around regulatory and safety, along with development and upgrading skills and so forth. So it's a little bit heavier bias in safety and fire for some of those regulatory and safety areas, but through the admin, which I'll focus on here, that is one of the larger increases to support that. We do see with some of these pressures, material savings and recruitment expenses. So I must highlight that then when we have the significant change or turnover in our staffing, that often bears very high one-time expenses for recruitment, especially for some of the more specialized positions. So where we think about our contract and consulting line in the expenses, we're able to see a material savings there that offsets some of those pressures. The idea is that stability over the next number of years will really help sustain that savings, and we'll see the labor costs stabilize as well. We see material savings of 30,000 year over year from the election. Obviously, last year was an election year, and that's a big one-time expense every 4 years, but that supports some of the savings. And then I want to highlight too around the organization. We're seeing we're presenting a decrease around the organization in forecast IT expenses. And we're fortunate to receive some grant funding or be able to apply some grant funding that allowed us to upgrade some of our fleet and improve the reliability. We got rid of some old equipment that was really expensive to maintain when it blew up. And we've been better able to use some of our space by creating hot desks. So kind of kill two birds with one stone. And then anticipate that that savings to be a little more sustainable as well. As I think about kind of that bigger picture admin budget, I focused on the operating expenses today. For those that were kind of curious on some of the variances to revenue, we do have the daycare project. We discussed that last time. So I say that to highlight that we have grant expense or grant revenue offset by expenses, which would show up in capital down below. So the focus of what I discussed here was the operating expense changes. So aside from that, we did see that we were able to offset or reduce some of our expenses. We didn't, as it is bottom up, we didn't want to lose the opportunity to kind of challenge the managers and the team to take advantage of areas where we could save as well. I've been talking a lot, and I'm sure there's some questions. Perhaps there are some questions. I want to create some space for that or feedback.
Taking us through nice and methodically, so no questions, you can.
Okay. And highlight on the next one, governance point at the bottom. That's the expense that we consider for council. That'd be page 8 of 110. There's not a lot that changes there. There's the little bit of a bump there for salaries in line with the bylaw that I talked about earlier. But the bigger I suppose savings or offset to that would be the IT expense allowance. As everyone knows here, and we've improved our security. We got some recommendations from providers that in year one of everyone's term, we update technology to a cost-effective and secure solution that comes out of the budget for 2023. Development services. Oh, I put it in a strange order. Normally I would higher, but I'll jump ahead and back. Development services. I worked with our development services manager, Mr. McCray. She evaluated a couple of things in his budget, and I bring to council's attention that we saw a significant increase in revenue in development services, both through application fees and building permits a couple of years ago, and it dropped. And it's a challenging one to forecast, but as we look at some of the views of where the market's going and what we're hearing from developers and the community, the view of developing this budget was that we're unlikely to see as strong of a year as we've seen in the past. And year to date, that's been true as well. So we took a very conservative view in forecasting revenue. So what you'll see is relative to 2022 budget, we did decrease our revenue forecasts in line with or below the bottom of these forecast bands that are maintained in our development service department. So I think that's one factor of that budget, which is really important and susceptible to market conditions. There are potential backstops through COVID-19 funding for revenue shortfalls. Those have been budgeted in the past, and there's an opportunity to offset some of that as well potentially. or explore that. And then additionally, I would highlight in the expenses of the budget, there's a decrease in the salaries line. So what that reflects is that we've taken a different approach to supporting building services and inspections, and that's reflected in the increase in contract services. So net, there's a savings, but the view is if there's less activity, our development services manager is able to call on our contractors less and realize some cost savings. So as we've looked and scrutinized that contractors and consultants line, that's only a small portion of that budget, but really importantly, the OCP and a lot of the associated activity is included in that as well. So it's a continuation of the longer term plan to develop that. Yeah, we definitely believe that this is a little more scalable to the demand that we're seeing. I would lastly just highlight that to bring everyone back to where we were when we first started this process. The view is that the service levels will be maintained. There shouldn't be any impact to that in exploring these changes have been in place for a while, and the team's been keeping up and doing great.
So under contract and consulting. Sorry, it'll take a minute for this to catch up again. Jesus, it's gonna be terrible.
That's not your iPad. It was tough to read some of the spreadsheets because they had to expand them and then they would get really slow.
What we're looking at is for 23 budget, $265,000. Within that amount of money, is there an opportunity to bring somebody on board that can do more of that stuff internally and put that towards the salary rather than spending that kind of money?
I would say that what we see is a net savings by proposing this approach. So as you might note above, there's a decrease of 80 in salaries and then some associated benefit savings, but net for the same amount of work, there are savings. So within that, it's not solely building inspection, there's also the OCP and some of the strategic priorities that the development services team is taking on. And some of those are contracted to in fact save money. You don't have to carry all the experts at a staff level.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm just curious why under the IT, is it under IT? Sorry, it is IT. That there's nothing budgeted in 2023 for.
I'd have to take a look. That might be a formula error. Thank you for bringing that to my attention. I can assure you there is meant to be something. I can speak to what should be there. And what I'll bring next time, there is both software and the cloud permitting software. The other thing that the development services as well as public works and water and sewer budgets would reflect is a coordinated effort to improve some of our GIS capacity. So I'll certainly have that updated in the next version that we're seeing here. Apologies. Trying to put everything on one page and translate it to the view for council, and the working model isn't quite as pretty to look at, believe it or not. If my memory serves correct, there is a it would be approximately last year's budget. It might be a slight increase, and in past we have been able to apply some of the COVID funding to offset that. So offsetting the tax impact.
And again, I'm not sure if this is the time to ask about, for the community climate action plan, like, that $10,000 that's allocated, is that for something specifically in mind?
Yeah, I believe Mr. McCray would have the details about what stage of the community climate action plan is included. Off the top of my head, I can't recall.
It's much less, so
Mhm.
I know there was a lot that went into actually creating the climate action plan, so. Yeah. I'll speak to that, I'm sure.
Mhm. Great. And I would highlight, just to kind of supplement that, there has been consideration of some of the recommendations of the community climate action plan reflected through the capital plan and through some of these discussions as well. So that'd be further development. Great. Fire. Page 9 of 110. And I would highlight for this one, for those that aren't especially familiar with the process, that there's a fire committee which reviews and scrutinizes this budget and provides feedback, and with a couple of partners through Millwatt and the SLRD, that review takes place before what you see here, and that is segregated between fire and rescue. So it's a whole lot of work that goes in before we landed this, but this was reviewed first. And I think some of the key story that I would highlight in the budget and what's presented here is that there is a focus on investing on the members with a view of improving retention and delivery, safety and culture. And some of the cash impact is around training especially, but this is a department that is primarily made up of volunteers. So that's only a small portion of approximately $150,000 of that honorarium and wages, but of huge impact obviously to the community. I would highlight embedded in this budget, there's an assumption for the continuation of Fire Smart BC funding. And we're just awaiting approval of that, but that's embedded, and there's a couple of the staff that are supported through that grant. And relative to last year's budget, and important to note in our assumptions, the honorarium and wages budget is largely driven by call volume, meaning the calls that the fire and rescue team get are proportional to the costs of the service. So we've seen a steady increase over the years as the community's grown, and Chief has worked in developing this budget to help forecast that and reflect it in the budget. And also included, and it would have been discussed last year, is there's a fire captain position. It was deferred, but it started in enroll this year, so that's reflected. And then going forward, and we chatted a little bit about it last time with the capital budget. We'll see it in future at a 5-year session, but with a lot of fire underwriters certification reviews and in capital planning, there is a demand over the next number of years for a significant replacement of a lot of the fleet. So Chief is working hard on reviewing that, and immediately there's engine 10, which is being proposed for approval, and that would be reflected for borrowing on our share of the, it's a $750,000 piece of equipment and $150,000 chassis expenses reflected in the financing assumptions here. And there's a long lead for any fire apparatus, as I understand it, and Chief, in coordination with the committees, scrutinizing to ensure that possible quotes are achieved. But again, with some priority there, they're trying to ensure that they're compliant and keeping everyone's insurance rates low.
So is that reflective in the fire debt servicing principle?
That's correct.
At 750,000?
Well, the 750,000, the 150,000 is what I've reflected here, that's the ordering of the chassis, so to finance the first stage, the arrival of the box and the rest of the truck would be 2 years later, so we're exploring options to borrow for that. That full amount going forward. We would need endorsement, and we're working with the committee and as part of the 5-year plan to approve that 750 in total. But in terms of the shorter term financing, we've tried not to overburden the whole thing up front, given it wouldn't arrive for a couple of years.
Yep.
Everybody else good?
Yeah. Goes all along, page 11 of 110 is where in the spreadsheet. This is Public Works and Parks. I would highlight as we started some of the demand on the service and some of the service mandates around really ensuring a safe and healthy community with investment and so forth that especially noted in the higher non-market change and some of the new entities, new assets in the community, that there's been growth. So with that new or the increased service area, the couple of soccer fields and the bike skills park, which opened up last summer. There is some demand to support that growth, and that's kind of the big story. The Public Works and Parks. I would highlight there is a bit of a salary increase reflected, but some of that's shared with the PVIS service through recreation, greenskeeping and so forth, and there's some increased demand around snow clearing and associated that is the bigger picture. And I think the team's done across a lot of the maintenance and parts and supplies and activity that you're seeing in this budget a great job at looking at the bottoms up approach, and they're taking a different look at tracking expenses, especially on servicing some of the vehicles in the fleet. And you may have noted when reviewing that there is like a decrease in maintenance and an increase in servicing, and that will create better tracking and visibility and cost control going forward. So a bit of housekeeping, but that's a view to kind of line up with the forecast activity.
Maybe a silly question. What is the difference between servicing and maintenance? Just, I realize that's a super technical question, but just kind of
Great question. And it's one that we actually kind of asked and reviewed a little bit with our auditors as well in terms of best practice. And the long and short is there's not necessarily best practice. I think when I think about developing these budgets with our managers, or our managers developing these budgets with me, the intent is that the transparency and the accountability and the ability to use them to control and optimize and maintain costs and services there. So in the case of this one, and Mr. Chamber can speak to it if he likes, but we worked with his assistant manager for operations, and we said, what do you need to manage your budget better, and what would help? And though we track each piece of equipment with a cost center, and we manage all of the invoices and expenses and tie them to those, so you can look at reports that show that level of detail. The big maintenance bucket was just too big, and we need to separate it to look at the fleet. And as we've talked about in the capital session, like the big expense to Public Works is aging trucks, aging equipment. And as we're seeing the costs go up over the years, we wanted to be able to manage that a little bit better. So the difference between the two is this allows us to segregate basically fleet from other maintenance.
Oh, okay.
Because at the same time, included in maintenance is painting the park benches and
Okay.
the buildings that we own and lease, and these are things that are included in that, but we wanted to segregate that to improve some of the year-over-year understanding of cost control as well.
Okay, thank you.
Summed up how you did it, Tom?
Exactly, basically it's vehicles and equipment maintenance as opposed to all maintenance, because maintenance includes soil and. You know. Grass seed and all that stuff is technically in the maintenance budget, but we wanted to have servicing more for vehicles and equipment.
Another big area of pressure, I would say this year. In the budget, which we do see reflected in an increase from $170,000 to $210,000. Is a road maintenance budget, so where I think most notably just saw two examples, one at the end of last year, one 2 weeks ago, with some of the water main breaks, a big element of maintenance or repair there is on some of the road resurfacing, between that and potholes, but also street lights and a lot of various infrastructure needs. There's an immediate demand for some of that repair. So we've highlighted that in priority with reflection of a increased budget. I would say we're still evaluating the impact of those couple of failures, and unfortunately our insurers aren't able to support that at this time. So we want to be mindful that we don't want to fall behind, and that is a growing priority that I would say probably has been deferred for a little bit. But at this stage in the budget, we're going to propose or try to see a little bit of increased priority there. I would highlight too, and in reference to one of the earlier questions, that there is a GIS prioritization around the organization that'd be reflected here as well, and SCADA, help me out with the
Supervisory control and data acquisition.
So the SCADA optimization around the organization is another area that we have a couple of costs both on front end and on support. I did highlight it isn't a large expense, but I think it's a really important area of attention that Mr. Chino is looking at in his budget, since the focus on water communications plans. So where there is a little bit in the communications budget or advertising budget, it's also something that aligns with one of the major themes around both the environment and emergency preparedness. So there's going to be a little more attention around that, and we've budgeted for that. And then again, I would highlight the fleet replacement strategy, which we talked about in the capital plan, is reflected in the in both the principal and interest. However, I would highlight too that when we previously reflected, or when we were previously included last year's budget, it was assumed that it was one Western Star replacement. And as we chatted about last time, there's a couple of vehicles that are proposed for that, which would be very similar to last year's budget.
What does the electric sign refer to?
Yeah, to help me specifically.
Putting one there?
That's one to go up in the circle that they were gonna do. And I did it before.
Might be a some comment. I don't know. Just let me.
It's under EV charger, it's
Under capital priority.
Staff had wanted to put an electric sign in there to replace the roundabout sign that would be controlled from Tom's phone.
I think on my phone, but office.
As opposed to having to go out there and replace boards.
Oh, okay.
So it was something that was identified a few years ago. That's just been, you want to give more detail to it?
Well, the Ministry of Transportation doesn't want a electric sign there because they feel that it's unsafe. we have tried to argue that it would be just static images, like it's not gonna be like animated things or anything, it would be basically what it is now. We can change the content. But the Ministry of Transportation did not support it. So it's something that we'd still like to do because we thought that it would be quite beneficial for emergency communications as well, especially during COVID. We were always putting new notices out and yeah, we haven't really fought them on it. But yeah. I didn't think we had still had a budget for that. Or is that from-
We don't have any this year, so there would be previous year's budget.
It's just on there and I was curious what it.
Yeah, I didn't remove anything that was on there from last go around, just so that the visibility of what's been completed or what's done or what's not been included is there as well. I would highlight it would only be the 2023 column though, that we'd be proposing for this year. Yeah, that is a lot. Just to highlight Mr. June's point, like there's a fair amount of administration that goes up with the sign, so definitely between deposits and for anyone in the community that's had to go through that process, we definitely would prefer something that's a little more efficient and automated, but it isn't, we didn't include it as a priority because of those reasons, again, this year.
And just one other question to Mr. Tima, and I apologize if you've already given me this answer, but with the park and ride, the 200,000 that's allocated in the agri park underneath, was there a talk, was that 200,000 at all? Was that a combination thing at all, or was that money purely for the park and ride?
The park and ride, we only have grant funding for the actual multimodal transportation hub. However, I included fairly substantial engineering costs in that grant application, and my intention was to have the engineering at least completed for the site grading and servicing of future gardens. So that agricultural park, we still don't have the money to build that, but we're basically building the framework for that, and we've applied for other grants for that as well. But this line item is well, that 200,000 that you mentioned is the engineering, and we are gonna kind of sneak in some engineering on the ag park as well.
Okay,
But technically, it's for the parking lot.
it's for the park and ride. Okay, that's, I remember us talking about it, and I thought there was a little bit of leaning into the agri park. But
It's just future planning. It's part of the engineering process.
okay,
Yeah.
yes. Because I guess the question is that all being looked at? Is it looked at as one sort of full piece, or?
We are definitely trying to do that, like rather than saying, okay, divide it in half, here's the park, like here's the ag part. That's why I've included the engineering costs for both, because we want to work a building that this will one day be an agricultural park as well.
And okay,
So that's how the design has been going so far.
awesome, thank you.
That's curious, you know, the church.
Any other questions?
Just to kind of highlight what we're talking about today, includes public works and parks, some of the support for Enduff Park is reflected separately, and that was discussed when we had our funding discussions around that service as part of the PBIS committee. So this doesn't reflect the costs of supporting that directly, but because of the cost share of some of the roles and so forth. I just wanted to draw that to everyone's attention.
I might ask them to Denda Park, is there a sharing also with the amenity building, or is that strictly under the grant?
What was the question, Terry?
With PVIS, is PVIS involved as far as Area C in helping funding the amenity building or any of the infrastructure on the site, or is that strictly all through the grant?
No, it's a combination of funding. Specifically, there is some SLRD contribution.
Their contribution, I believe, was included in our portion of the contribution towards the grant. Like the grant covers 75% or something of the costs, and it's their contribution, I believe, was built into our contribution I think 1%, yeah, whatever the percentage was.
How much was it?
I don't remember.
Okay.
I feel like it was 92,000. I seem to remember that number, but I might be wrong.
No, that's good, thank you. I don't kind of see it here and I needed to clarify that, so thank you. Of course, I don't see a lot.
Water and sewer. Again, I think I want to highlight, because I think before I knew a little bit of what the services were, I really liked Mr. Chima's approach to focusing on some public education and communicating everything from conservation to the importance of investing in infrastructure. So I'd highlight, though they're not big increases, that there is some advertising expense allocated for that, to make sure people understand the importance of this. There's initiatives throughout the year embedded in the budget. I would highlight in water, just because there's been a little bit of curiosity that as part of the budget that we did discuss last time, there's inclusion of some commercial meters to better understand usage. I would highlight there's an investment in GIS and SCADA, as we've talked about around the organization as well. But this, with maintaining safe and healthy services, safe and healthy drinking water and reliability for the fire service, there is a very routine element of this as well. The biggest drivers of cost here are things like soda ash and chlorine that are required to keep the operations running stably, along with maintenance of some of the aging infrastructure. I think that I'll pause for a second for any questions around the budget. I did highlight there's an allocation earlier in salaries and wages. That is an allocation of overhead at standard rates we talked about earlier.
I just had a question on, for curiosity on water and fuel. It just seems there's a lot of changes across the board and I just wasn't sure what it was.
Yeah.
What that refers to. It says water and then fuel and then it.
Yeah, so that would be
Yeah.
the fuel expense directly for the vehicles. And
Okay.
previously the budget was 21,000, but we're seeing that about $4,200 of direct charges were incurred last year. So when we look at that cost center view of the of tracking, we've been able to improve a little bit of visibility. We've tried to ensure that the receipts that are received from when the operators are out there filling up the trucks are reflected accurately in the budget. Generators as well. That's correct.
The one generator.
Yeah.
And sorry, so I just had a question about the soda ash and chlorine. So is that or just that increase? Is that just the amount of soda ash, like what the amount of product we're having to use to treat the water as no?
What's the cost?
If the cost has just gone up, yeah, okay.
We've seen impacts across the board on all of our parts and supplies.
Yes.
Just inflationary costs.
Yeah, okay.
And previously, like when we looked at the 2022 budget as an example, which was 97,500, because of what Mr. Chima has mentioned and what we've seen, that is one of our bigger increases. We landed at 123,000 last year for routine
Okay, yeah.
activity. So we did forecast a little bit of the pressure there, but tried to be conscious that that is an area that we are seeing that impact.
Yeah, oh no, I just wanted to make sure I understood if it was that because I know sometimes the water composition changes with that, yeah, great, thanks.
The consumables, yeah, we've seen major cost increases. We've seen probably, I don't want to say the whole percentage, there has been a slight percentage increase in our overall water use from this 2022 to 2021. But it's negligible compared to the costs.
They got that, we just went, yeah.
There's like 1% more use overall than the whole year, so. Yeah, that's not the change that we're seeing, it's just purely on the cost of the stuff.
I just wanted to echo what you said about sometimes the advertising, because we do advertise for a lot of things and we maybe take sewer and water for granted and things, have the advertising around water conservation, and I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Replacing the water line, moving up to 30 from 10 or whatever we got out on Sturley's property, is that included in here?
Gray Road.
We have items on McCray Road, upsizing of water main, I think in this.
That's in the capital plan and noted below as well.
That's the bottom one there?
Yeah, and that was, as we look at the 5-year capital plan. The broader Gray Road water main upsizing is over 3 years.
Over 3 years?
Well, we had pricing based on from the private property to the highway, from the highway to the edge of the McCray Road, and then from the McCray Road up. So there was sort of broken down into 3, so we decided to base that over 3 years, but just based on our other capital projects and priorities.
So next year we'll be looking at another cost factor for a third of the project again? Or does this represent the whole,
This would be the 2023 share, so
just the 2023?
yeah, so roughly it's approximately a third in each year.
Total cost.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I should just say, we didn't just divide it by 3, it was based on the 3 cost estimates, but they're roughly about.
About the same, actually. Okay, yeah, thanks.
Sewer. Talked about public education and priority. I did highlight some of the big drivers of what happens in this budget. Sometimes people aren't necessarily familiar with what's happening downstream or underground, and I thought I'd highlight a couple. You might want to talk a little bit about the largest year-over-year increase or requirement, which is the receiving environment monitoring program.
Sure.
We try to defer it, as I understand it.
Yeah, so. Those of you that were on previous council might remember that in 2019. It was identified that according to our operating permit for the wastewater treatment plant, just a reminder, this is what treats the sewage waste for the village. We had no monitoring program for the receiving environment. So the receiving environment is the river that your effluent is going into. So we have treatment, we test the effluent. It meets whatever requirements, but they also specify that the Ministry of Environment, they specify that you must also take samples once a year from the river to make sure that there's no accumulation of any pollutants that could potentially cause harm to that receiving environment. Now, the way that our plant is designed, we outflow into the Lillooet River, which has flows 100 times that of some other plants, and it's really not a concern. However, it is still technically a requirement. So we've done that now 2 years in a row. This will be the 3rd year that we do the receiving environment monitoring program, which is basically going out in a boat and sampling. We have to do 5 different samples over the course of 2 months. So it's a very expensive process for something that basically proves what we already know, that there's no harm. So we've included that in the budget. I guess Mr. Sikora is including it to show that that's a large cost increase from 3 years ago, but also we've asked our consultants to assist us in making a case with the Ministry of Environment to relax those requirements. Because with 3 years of data, we anticipate that the evidence is there that we do not require this stringent. Maybe every 5 years we can do this monitoring program to show that nothing's changed, but we already have the samples of our effluent, which are well below the requirement limits. And that there's no evidence to suggest that there's any accumulation into the environment. So that's this slightly higher than last year's. They also charge more than they did last year, but like we talked about, everything's costing more, but we've also included for them to assist us in that communication with the ministry to basically get us out of having to do this every year from now on. Sorry if that was overly complicated.
No, that was super.
It is a fairly substantial piece of our budget, and it's one
What's the number on that again?
50,000.
This is like, just to kind of familiarize council with with some of the approach we've taken to developing these budgets, we're really breaking down all of our costs and having these discussions about what are we seeing today, what are our pressures, but how can we mitigate or reduce or meet requirements, obviously. And this is one of the, I think, better examples of that.
So essentially, our consultants have proposed, I think it's $8,000 or $9,000 to help us with the preparation of an application to the Ministry of the Environment to then save us a $40,000, monitoring every year. So it's a little bit upfront now, but if we can save, even if it's just every other year, $40,000 or $50,000 a year.
Great, I picked off a couple of other interesting items in the budget that were of note. We do have requirements for some of the alcohol dive sections.
Well, the requirement for that is actually only every 5 years, but again. Previous members of council will remember that we had an outfall blockage a few years ago, and I think I've talked to this council as well, and so we've decided to continue doing that on our own, just because 5 years a lot can change with that sediment aggregation in the river. So we decided to continue the yearly outfall inspections for preventative measures.
And then also included there's routine flushing and some expense for generator outages, and then there are some TLC upgrades required. So those are the programmable logic controllers, and they're reaching end of life.
Well, I mean, as you can imagine, like laptops these days only last 4 or 5 years before they're obsolete, and these were put in 20 years ago now. So they're still
back in style then.
Got a very resourceful wastewater treatment plant operator. It's incredible if anyone has a chance to go out there to just appreciate like the depth of his knowledge and skill and the way he keeps the place running. It's probably the best field trip I go on.
There's one thing that's not noted on here, but I thought I mentioned, I know we built it into the maintenance budget, but we're going to try a new additive in our treatment process as well, because we've been having some trouble with the phosphorus levels on the treatment, which is pretty common for these types of plants, especially. Basically, the living organism that processes the sewage, it's the conditions required for the treatment of such and such parameters is opposite from the conditions required for the phosphorus treatment. So we're basically looking at trialing an additive of alum, it's called, that helps this process, and we're sort of teetering on the edge of the maximum for phosphorus. So that's just it's potential. If it works, then we're very happy, but it might be some capital changes that we would make to the plant to have this additive, or it might just be another consumable that we have to use, but we're just trialing it this year. So I think we have it was something like $1,500 a month on this material if we're going to try. And supposedly it's only in the winter when it's really cold that we'll probably need to use this. So it might only be for 6 months of the year, but we've budgeted for the full 12 months of this particular additive.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Next two budgets to quickly touch on include transit and the airport. For those following along, transit is page 14 of 110. I think what we've observed in terms of activity and noted in revenue over this last year and ridership really is that there's continued demand and pressure on the transit service coming out of the COVID-19 times. As we've kind of mentioned when thinking about service levels, we're continuing to explore options to support that service. So we've been working with BC Transit to understand what potential expansion or service looks like that would better meet demand. And immediately, we're exploring utilization of the deadhead route of the local service bus. That's the smaller of the two, when it's heading back on its schedule. So trying to pick up some of the extra transit riders that during the peak demand of the ski season, where there's a lot of demand for going to work and so forth. Trying to make sure we can do that and working with BC Transit to include that. I highlight to council too that there is quite a long lead to getting service expansion with BC Transit at this time. Around the province, and we're successful in securing that extra funding. So definitely some headwinds with respect to service expansion, but we're really trying to make sure that we're meeting the demand and looking forward as well. But what is reflected here is the annual operating agreement, which maintains that same growth. That's the budget that comes from BC Transit, and it shows a 5.4% increase. I did include here that we do have a bit of a risk to the funding split. I took a more conservative view in reflecting that in this budget, but what we do see here is an increase to the allocation to the transit from general transit taxation that highlights that.
Maybe I'll give a little more history and background on that. So a number of years ago, the local transit was funded 40% BOP, 40% LEWA, and 20% Area C. This is like 12 years ago or whatever, 10 years ago. I'm gonna say 6+ years ago, we went to 1/3 split. 3 partners. Over the last number of years, Director Mack has been paying his share, the Area C share, through CACs as opposed to a service area, direct time taxation to Area C residents. Then he goes into his CACs to pay for it.
And that stands for.
Yeah, community contributions. So we collect them. That's even. There was a really big conversation at a recent board meeting about how CACs should be used and managed. But it's sort of a pot of money that area directors, he'll use some for Divine Transfer Station, the Meadows Fire Department, they use that. Service area is more defining an area. Everybody within that area pays into the service. That's how the service is paid for, right? I have been encouraging from the moment I sat down next to Russell him to set up a service area. Like literally 8-9 years ago, I said, dude, you got to stop paying out of your CACs. I would recommend we set up a service area. Coming out of that conversation as well, we need to do a bit of a review of the service and see how Area C residents can get more and And I'll try to give you the brief part of the history, but bottom line is now there's a whole queue at the SLRD of service area establishments and people want to see done, and it takes a couple of years to get it done. So we're still in a position where it's being paid through CACs. We're also at a place in time now where we're, hopefully I want to be even stronger than that, but that regional transit will be coming sooner than later. When our regional transit system is set up, it will, in my mind, and what I've been encouraging with our partners, absorb the Mount Currie to Whistler portion of our local transit, right? That it'll be now Mount Currie down to Vancouver. That'll be within the regional transit. We, the local partners, will then continue to provide, govern and finance the local bit, which is currently Mount Currie to town, and hopefully we'll have some extra funds. We'll be able to expand that. So we'll get to the farther reaches of Area C, maybe up to the new site, that sort of thing. And we'll look at that as we go. So, the funding model is going to change in a couple of years in terms of that 99 bus route. Backtrack again now, about 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, whatever it was, we did go through with this transit sort of review study that was contracted for Area C. It was done over 9 days during the pandemic. There's a lot in my mind, a lot of gaps, we'll say, within this study. BC Transit has recognized, and our transit partners have recognized that there's gaps within this study. And that it's not enough to base true user ridership over. Area C has taken the line that, well, it shows like, 4% usage from Area C residents in that 9-day period during the pandemic. And therefore they should not be paying 1/3. So last year, Director Mack came to the table and said, instead of paying 1/3 this year, I'm going to pay 20, and next year I'm going to pay 15. We brought that to the transit committee. Transit committee was not happy. We was like, well, we can't change our budgets right now. Took it back to the regional district board. And I said, look, I feel like we're taking a step backwards in transit here. We're trying to build our regional transit. If Area C pulls out of some of these funds, we might have to reduce service rather than expand it. At the time, the board said we were in the middle of a transit strike. I'm sorry for the long history, but it's all pertinent. We're in the middle of a transit strike. So the board made the resolution that whatever savings were accrued through the strike, in other words, the fact that we weren't paying into our contract for 4 months, we accrued some savings. We would put that towards the shortfall by the reduced funding made by Area C. If that wasn't enough to cover, the regional district has $50,000 in a regional transit fund. The rest of the board, even though it's for the whole region, recognizing that this would be a step backwards in regional transit in our area, said, if it's not enough money there, we'll fund it. You can fund the shortfall through the $50,000. We never needed to go to the $50,000. Unfortunately, the strike lasted way too long. And so this shortfall didn't have as much of an impact. This year, Director Mack's, direction was to pay 15%. And again, I've argued against this study saying, we can't start. First of all, I've argued that transit is a bigger service. We don't just pay for it if we use it. It's like schools, it's like roads. You have, it's like diking, these things that we don't necessarily use, but we pay for into society for all of society's benefit, including our own. Secondly, I said, if we start breaking it down into little bits, I said, how many Village of Pemberton residents are on the Mount Creative Pemberton Fund? Not that money. We shouldn't pay for that segment, but we should pay for this segment. It's a slippery slope. Let's agree that we're trying to provide transit. Let's partner up on the cost and make it happen. If Area C residents are not well served by it, let's figure out how to get them more service, right? So that's sort of been my approach to it, but we're back at that stage, and that's what Thomas is referring to up there, the risk to funding split. So last week at our regional district meeting, during budget sessions, this came up. And I said that the transit committee, when we're trying to call a meeting with the transit committee, has not discussed this funding split for this year. That I did not want to approve it at the board without having talked to the transit committee. It seemed disrespectful to our other partner. And that I still struggle with that whole funding split and made my whole pitch about it. So there will be a transit committee meeting. There was consideration at the board again to perhaps go back to that $50,000 fund if needed at the regional district. But it's basically been referred to our transit committee, where I know there will be a fulsome conversation with all partners in terms of how we move ahead on this. I said in the last meeting 2 things. I said 3 things. Number one, the transit committee and all of us have discussed the option of perhaps the RMLW and or Vail paying into the service, since it benefits employers there. Secondly, BC Transit is supposed to give some comment on that study that was done, but sorry, I lost my chain of thought on that. Oh yeah, so I said that to find other funding shortfall sources, there's the growth fund that was just recently announced. So I said, although that's not supposed to go for operating, but maybe there's a potential to bridge that shortfall. And I use the term bridge because I'm hopeful again that regional transit will be in place in a year or 2, and we won't be having this conversation again. So we're just trying to get through another year or 2 to get to that point. So I suggested the Growing Communities Fund. And I also pointed out very clearly again, I said, we've got Wedgwoods, which has been on the table for some additional units and construction. There's some community amenity contributions coming through that. I said, here's an example of a development that's gonna put pressure on our transit system. It's right in the middle of the line. It's a natural fit. We should be picking these people up. Maybe we should be looking at CHCs through that development to bridge us for the next year. So I put on that on the table. There's a transit committee meeting coming up. It'll come back to us and the board after that. Any questions on that?
Thank you very much. I know some of these are one bullet lines, but there's a lot of depth.
Yes. That's great.
Yes, we did try to highlight, like when I worked with the managers, we tried to really highlight areas that might be really pertinent to feedback to, and really, I'm trying to create a dialogue where we need or provide input, so that I can change anything if we need also.
I know we're talking about risk to funding split, but I'm just curious, it's a curious question, has there ever been, are there any numbers about students and bus passes and what the cost of that would be if they were free? Has that ever been done?
There was a proposal that was brought forward last year, and I want to say this is one that I don't want to get wrong, but it was, I believe, over $100,000, that order of magnitude.
Can we bring that back actually? Because that's.
I can bring that number back.
After the request from PSS kids and all that, staff went away and did a bit of an analysis, what it would look like.
Yeah,
The better
so
stuff.
I'll bring that back next time and get the correct numbers. Yeah. A note here. It'll be all right if I just circulate that with the room before and then just chat about it next time. Sure. Okay. Interestingly too, embedded in this and in the AOA agreement with transit, there's going to be a rollout of what's called the UMO system. It's the pay technology. So BC Transit is going to be getting much better data in terms of understanding ridership, and we'll take down some barriers to accessing the bus, meaning you have a credit card or various methods to load up a phone. They'll still take cash, but my understanding of that operational rollout is that they'll have a better understanding as well of ridership and patterns and so forth. So I think that segmentation of as you notice in the revenue of all of the different collections will only be improved, because you'll understand that, a portion of the fare box revenue, that the cash in the box, you'll see some of that will be more clear and granular when the revenue comes through.
With the ridership,
Mhm.
I asked this question before, will we be able to determine how many routes are being taken that the buses are empty? Because we've talked about trying to get a bus depot here. And it starts from here and ends here. Rather than starting in Whistler, which the buses come down empty. And at the end of the night, they go home empty. So how many trips are we paying for that there's no ridership?
So embedded in some of the assumptions here and through some of the work that we've done with BC Transit, some of those deadhead trips where they would have been empty in the past, they will be filling some of those buses, and BC Transit right now is working through adopting that into the schedule. But I think it's an extra 6 minutes to get to the final destination. But in terms of, there's a couple of factors which challenge that. And I want to make sure I kind of think through a few parts of your question. On one hand, a lot of the benefit to service and secure storage is currently existent in Whistler. Driver availability has been a challenge. I understand that through some of the union contracts and so forth, there's challenges in even securing routine routes throughout the corridor, being from Squamish to Whistler all the way up here. So there's some impact due to some of the staffing challenges which impact scheduling. but yeah, in terms of area of focus. For me, I've really been working to make sure that that empty bus is filled when we have 12 to 14 people standing at the line. That's what happened in the summer. We saw in a couple of the segments over 300% growth year over year. And we heard the feedback from the community through some of the service requests and so forth. And that has become a priority. So instead of a typical route increase, which I understand takes about 2 years to introduce with BC Transit, that was like the low hanging fruit, the quick win that we've been working with them to formalize.
Yep.
Great. Airport. Short comments, lots of depth to these ones though. We had a discussion previously about maintaining service levels and a lot of the requests we've seen and year over year maintenance has revolved around maintaining safe operations, but balancing the priorities around snow removal in winter operations, trying to ensure that there's periodic snow clearing and routine maintenance. We haven't changed any of those assumptions, and what you see reflected in this budget is business as usual, no service increases. But I would highlight another one of the service objectives around a legal reduction strategy. Is something that we thought about when working with in developing this budget. We did see pressure in 2022, in part because of lease renewals, but in part because of demand from some of the user groups. So that we had a forecast budget of 6,000. We did see pressure last year, and we look to mitigate some of that pressure this year through some of the expectations that we have going forward. Any questions around? I have a pretty comprehensive appendix that talks about everything from each of the individual budgets, which I've been asking everyone to follow along with. Including service objectives, but I might pause to see if there's any questions or input or areas that council you feel I might have missed or want to clarify. We do have some time coming up, as I mentioned previously, to talk about tax implications, reserves, some of the discrete funding assumptions around some of our grants. And yeah, just wanted to, as we think about those next steps, wanted to see if there's anything that we want to address or explore further today.
Yeah, when we're talking about reserves coming up, concerns in my mind, and this is just my own personal feeling, is taking a look again at the OCP and the timeline and the extra costs that could come up. Working through that over the next 2 to 3 years and how we're maybe going to fund that. The other thing I've got in mind here, and I've brought it up before, and I hate to keep hitting on it, but reserves for the RCMP. I know that this year it's $288,000, but in 5 or 7 years it may be $1.3 million, and I still want to get an idea how we're going to get there. So that's not a one-time hit. The other thing I'm looking at, again, this is my own feeling, is how we can put together a land assembly so that we can actually deal with the housing issue in town, and how we can move some money around or find some way for reserves so that we can actually purchase land. Because without land, we can't do housing that what the community is looking for. So I guess that's in my mind as far as that kind of goes too. Right?
Ask a few follow-up questions just so I understand what you're looking for staff to bring forward. So regarding the OCP, who Mr. McRae here is developing, would it be helpful if we did bring forward, would it be helpful if we brought forward the schedule of the budget over the next couple of years? I know when we look at our contractor consultant budget, when Scott and I have been developing this, he's got a plan for the next couple of years and what that looks like. Is that the level of detail that you're looking to understand?
I want to take a look at that, but how it relates to our neighbors, Lillooet Nations being involved. And how that may add to the time frame, which obviously would add to the cost.
The potential for our consultation with Niwa Nation on our OCP, potential for that going past the projected timelines, because we want to do a fulsome consultation. It could result in longer than a foreseen timeline. Tell me if I'm getting you wrong here, Ted. The idea is that this could go on longer than we thought, and therefore should we be planning some funds for it?
Will that be something we can work on over the next week to provide next year? Mr. McRae, does that make sense?
Through the chair, yeah, I think that would be, that could be achieved. There's a great deal of uncertainty, I think it's fair to say, regarding the consultation with the Lillooet Nation, the OCP project. We have some tentative first steps for sure, but I have a feeling it's going to be a journey for sure. So to what extent that impacts the progress of the project as well is also uncertain. There's many different avenues and ways. There's so many different aspects of the project that some parts may continue, other parts may be delayed, depending on what unfolds with the Lillooet Nation discussions with Lillooet Nation. So I hope that's helpful.
No, it's helpful, and the reason I'm bringing up, I saw what Whistler went through. When they didn't do a full consultation, and it ended up being a lot longer situation in court occurrences and quite a huge money increase. So what I'm trying to do is kind of see that we're planning ahead, not that we hope is going to happen here, but the consultation period may take a little bit longer. And we only budgeted X amount of money for the consultants. And at the end of the 2-year period, that could be a further cost. So that's all I want to kind of be ahead of the game on that. Thank you.
Around the RCMP reserves, just looking for a little clarification, kind of update from where we were last time. So when we explored this concept in past, since staff has met with staff at the RCMP to understand what that implication looks like, and the current view through census data is that when we are looking at the 5-year plan, the projected population growth wouldn't reach a threshold. Still, that would require that transitionary funding to be invoked. My understanding is that through UBCM last year, there was a resolution or support and visibility of this brought forward to highlight this very significant impact in small communities in terms of closing that gap. But I guess my question would be, is the request to bring forward the a reserve, or what would council like to see for the next session to reflect kind of the impact of that RCMP reserve?
I guess for my opinion, it's like we did with the water reserve a number of years ago. We said we needed to increase the water reserves. How we're going to do that? And we put in a 4% a year for the next 3 years. So it went 4, 8, and 12 until we caught up to what we want to have for the reserves. I guess I don't want to see us in 7 years time. We're going to pick a date that we're on. In essence, we haven't put a reserve together. And all of a sudden we're now, and the government hasn't come along to do anything in between, because there's nothing in this budget for it. So will there be in the next budget? Well, it's the election year next year. So who knows what's going to happen? So I'm thinking it's at least 3 years down the road before they deal with it, if they're going to do anything. So I guess my point is I would rather build up a reserve by a taxation going forward every year for the next number of years. So that when we hit that 7-year limit, we've got the money already being charged that'll cover it.
It's as much about building a reserve as it is to incrementally increasing the taxation to hit to that point that we're gonna get at as opposed to one hit.
Yeah, that's what
And
I,
in the meantime, build a reserve.
yeah, that's kind of what I'm looking for.
Okay, so I guess would then the appropriate presentation of that be including a reserve assumption with the tax implication to complement the others for next session? Allow that for council's consideration.
But to add to the full reserve list that you're gonna bring forward.
And to kind of speak freely, I think one of the challenges that the staff had when meeting with the RCMP was pinpointing a number and what that transition looks like. So there's a tranched approach to supporting ancillary services and some of the demand to transition. But we tried really hard to figure out what that cost is, because it's not absorbing the entire service in year one. But it is something that we are prioritizing to understand what that transition looks like. So this, I think, would supplement that in planning for future.
And I guess that's what I want to find is a transition period that if we don't get it from the government, how do we as a community transition to that final cost, which we've got what, 5 members now with 3,500. So if we get to 5,000, does that mean 8.5? And now we're paying $1 million instead of roughly 300,000. So I'm trying to close that gap between what we're paying now and what we could be paying. That's what I'd kind of look at.
Did you see the letter in the response from UBCM to our resolution? Yeah. Good news is they're looking at it and reviewing it.
Yeah, which is good.
Yeah, we got a little bit of time, so.
Yeah, we can draw. But in the meantime.
Yeah, no, I'm not,
And I'm not familiar with the land assembly proposal. We haven't included anything of that direction. What would council like to see regarding that? I might need some help with this one.
I guess that was again, something I brought to the table is that we were allocated some money from the provincial government recently that had some requirements on it, like go to water and stuff like that. That was a $2 million some odd thousand that's coming. My personal thinking was it'd be nice to use that maybe towards another project that maybe involves water or sewer or something like that. Bore against that amount to look for some land that we could eventually put housing on. If we own the land, then we can get money through CMHC and federal and provincial to do that. But if we don't own the land, we're not going to be able to help out that housing aspect. So I guess in my mind, I was looking at, okay, how can we move land around that we own against maybe potential purchase and trade off and use some money to purchase some property. That's a little further out, but I mean,
it's another reserve, it's basically another reserve, so that we have money in the account reserve to say, here's a land acquisition opportunity. So to me, I think we would be looking at another reserve account called land acquisition or whatever. And when we do our reserve discussion next week or in 2 weeks or whatever, again, you can bring all that forward and go, hey, council, here's some reserve opportunities. Where do you want to put your money?
And I think, and I think we do have some money in land reserves. I think we got some money when we sold the property out there, 340,000. I'm picking a number.
Right, ballpark, I was looking.
Yes,
something right.
We got some money from a property we sold down by Napa. And so I guess what I'm thinking is, if we're gonna buy land, we're probably looking at excess of $3 million, I would think. And how do we get to that point where we have some assets and some cash reserves that we can get there without having to bore the home?
Go ahead, Lauren.
That's clear. No, it isn't.
I just, because that to my mind is like, seems like if we're talking about just maybe like looking at a bringing forward some level of a reserve, what we could look at, but I think kind of anything beyond that, that almost seems like another conversation and a separate conversation, because also being aware that if we haven't even had a fulsome discussion about what is the best way to address affordability in this community, and land acquisition and having land in which we can do stuff may very well be it, but if we haven't talked about it and then now all of a sudden we're taking money that we could be spending on other projects that we know are a priority and immediate benefit versus I guess I have some reservations when we haven't really talked about what our intention is in terms of affordable housing. If we keep talking about it, we haven't had a chance to sit down and really start investigating what the opportunities are. And so like, I think looking at a reserve, but kind of,
So this isn't any commitment, this wouldn't be
Any commitment,
to
yeah.
any specific sort of approach to housing. It would be putting some money aside in the bank account so that as we explore and future councils explore options for housing. Well, how can we do it? Well, we have 500 grand here that we can leverage to buy this or that. And so two things, like as an example, right now we're looking at Fire Hall, and it doesn't even have to be necessarily affordable housing. It's land reserve, a fund with money in it. So right now we're looking at Fire Hall and Muni Hall. If we had one of those accounts that we built up years ago, maybe we would have 500 grand or $1 million put away that we could then go, okay, this is going towards the Fire Hall land acquisition. So it's not a commitment to any specific sort of thing. And even I think equally important is right now what we're talking about is, hey, Thomas, when you come back, have a space for land acquisition as a reserve. We will sit down and go, here's our budget, here's some tax implications, here's our reserve proposal. Well, you know what, we really need to put reserves in roads, as mentioned earlier, or whatever it is we start to decide. And we can't, there's no way we're going to be able to afford to really build up an RCMP account this year, land account this year, land account. We can't put into every reserve this year. It's not going to happen. So we will make these choices when they're all laid out in front of us, all these reserve accounts that we want to look at. And then as a council, we could say, do you want to put in a land acquisition? Well, we don't even know what we want to do with it. Yeah, maybe we do, whatever. We're going to, that's.
Yeah, it was just, I was kind of just with the detail that was starting to get discussed. I just kind of thought that was maybe putting the cart ahead of the horse. So
Yeah.
that, yeah, if it's just kind of coming back with potential scenarios.
Do we build a savings account for the purchase of land is going to be the question before us in 2 weeks. Do we even build that savings account? If so, do we put $5 in, 50,000, whatever?
Yeah.
Yeah, I might ask a follow-up because you had a point around some of our priorities and maybe helpful to understand some of council's thinking. But as we think about that provincial funding, the $2,002,000 and some of our priorities around water and awaiting decisions around some of our grant applications for the water treatment plant for $8.6 million and some of these would it be appropriate or would council like to see have a discussion about that in context as well? I mean, if we're funding $1.6 million through borrowing versus a portion of that through this funding, which would be deemed an eligible expense, like what does the timeline look like for council to start exploring that?
What seems to me, I mean, the way I understand how we're walking through this process, we're doing the budget on its own, on its island, as we normally would. When we get there in 2 weeks, we're gonna go, shoot, we can't afford everything we want to do. At which point staff will go, oh yeah, but you could pay for this one at a gas tax, or you could pay for this one at a COVID restart. Considering the growth fund as well, to me, the growth fund was something we were going to consider as a group after having gone through the budget process. It's hard to completely ignore. We look at some of these projects here and go, oh, if we can't afford it this year, maybe the growth fund. So, I mean, it's there in the back of our heads, but in my mind, we were going to build a budget around our priorities and the funds that we have available. Again, recognizing we're not going to get it all in there, we'll explore other aspects of funding for like gas tax and restart. And as I've said before, then we can go into a visioning. Some discussion about where we want to use the $2 million, and as I've said before, I want to make sure we're not using money somewhere that we can get money somewhere else. So in other words, if there's a grant opportunity for this, then I don't want to spend our money, newfound money on that. Let's go after the grants but to me, I'm a little leery about bringing the $2 million into this whole budget conversation. I feel it's going to muddy the waters a lot. I think if we know that it's there, we're going to do the budget. We're going to make some hard decisions in a couple of weeks about what remains in the budget and what might have to get postponed or scratched. And then after that, we could go, okay, well, I really want to see X done this year. Should we look at the growth fund as part of that conversation? Is
That's very helpful, and there may be a few cases where looking at some of the priorities and direction where we'll get more clarification from council. There might be some cases where we might propose that, we have potentially an obligation to just use the water treatment plant as an example. If we get an announcement that that's approved, if we're successful, we might have that discussion about whether it is borrowing or looking at various funds. So I think that would be the intention of that next session, to include some of that, those hard conversations.
Yes, so just so I'm clear, so the next session, we'll try and get into the nitty gritty a bit more about what stays, what goes.
Yeah, and the other piece. Yeah, and the other piece, historically, the way the budget process has gone, we tend to propose a couple of solutions or a couple of options for potential tax increases. It's worth a little more than $20,000 per percent right now. And oftentimes those can be dedicated or allocated to investment reserves looking forward. So those would be the scenarios that would come forward with that one as well. One observation I've made in my little bit of time doing this now is that oftentimes you get a very different public engagement, whether you lead with tax increases to start or whether that discussion happens at the end. So we have seen some pretty significant increases to support some of those initiatives around the province this year, but I'll bring a few scenarios for council to look at as well.
Anything else? Input? Awesome. Anything more from you?
Yeah, thank you very much. I really appreciate all the questions and feedback. Thank you.
Thanks, Alice.
Very much.
Thanks so much.
We need a motion.
Well, the request that I did have in the report was for committee of the whole by direction to staff with respect to any changes to the budgets as presented, and I captured a few notes and a few things to bring forward for next session. Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I just ask if we have another report, could I get it in print?
Sure, certainly.
Thank you.
Yeah, I can put a package together.
This one was weird. I don't know, like I tried to open it in two different ways and you could zoom in on one and then it would come all the way over here and you'd have to bring it over and then you'd have to shrink it to be able to scroll down. It was just a big.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Thomas.
Thank you.
Okay, last item is 5.1, background report on Hillside Trails, Mr. McCray.
Good afternoon, Mayor and Council.
Thanks, Thomas.
Maybe it's possible to use that. Here, something. I'm not sure. Okay, I don't have the, well, sure, I'm not sure. I just wanted to pull up the village GIS. If I can.
Okay.
I don't know, I don't have any like publicly accessible right here. So that's right, I have the shirt.
You limited to 2 minutes.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, you know that, that's.
30 seconds are left, and now we won't vote. Okay, the council chambers. It's no more. See if we can get it on this computer and if not, I won't put that part of it. Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. The purpose of this report is to inform the committee of the whole about basically give background on the hillside development and the impact of trails in the area. So as committee may recall, at the last regular council meeting, a motion was passed to have a discussion and to bring information to council about the recent development activity as it relates to trails in that area on the hillside. So the area in question is known as the Ridge and Sunstone. Those areas have been steadily developed since about 2011, since the zoning amendment in 2011. I know there's more history than that, but that's good enough for now. During those initial discussions, the village and the developer discussed and agreed to a concept known as a net gain in trails. So that's kind of saying any trails that will be disrupted or changed as a result of the development will be built back better. So these lands that, here we go. If I can do this for you. I thought this would be a fun opportunity to showcase the village's GIS system, which we with our GIS latest new GIS issue. We've been very fortunate to find a very talented individual who has made huge progress in helping us set up our GIS. So I will share my screen to show you. Okay. So yeah, this is the new GIS system, and I'll just bring it into the area we're talking about, which is the land known as Sunstone, which is this parcel right here. The parcel in question. Set up ahead of time, but to try to not stare you all trying to fiddle with all the layers and things. But anyway, that's fine. That's the parcel in question. So this land, as you may know, there's a base map that shows the trails, which I can't pull up right now. You guys see what's this section? One of those guys that just has to have it just right. Here we go. Okay, there we go. That's what I was looking for. Yeah, there we go. So you can see the trail network as well. Ooh. That's sort of very, very fun.
Yeah, my dog.
You want me to put the face wrap up?
No, I got it. So there we go.
Did you just know that you needed help?
Exactly. So as you can see, this land has a very extensive recreational trails on top of it. And so this network includes some 13 well-known trails in the valley, and most of them is the Green Top Trail. The village is a little bit of background. The village's OCP lays out development permit area guidelines. One of those is DPA #1 for environmental protection, which includes various development permit area guidelines related to development, especially around rough grading and new construction, trying to mitigate the impacts. And it does include a statement around trails. As another small digression, the Village of Pemberton's development permit bylaw 887, or sorry, development procedures bylaw 887/2020 delegates to staff the issuance of minor development permits. So that's there's a detailed definition in the bylaw about what counts as a minor development permit. It's small amendments to major development permits, as well as development permits in area 1 that are not near a riparian area. So as the developer of these lands progress through their project, they apply for a development permit to begin upgrading of the next segment of road. Their development permit application met all relevant development permit area guidelines. And so a development permit, a minor development permit was issued to them. Getting direct to the point of this report, the closure of the Green Puff Trail is a temporary measure for construction safety. Now that the project has, the construction activity has reached that point where it crosses the trail, the developer has opted to close the trail temporarily for safety reasons, especially in liability around construction. But they have great, they are very consistent that they plan to preserve this trail to their best of their abilities, including by establishing an SRW, a statutory right of way over the trail, and including some sort of buffer zone on each side of it to try to provide the best trail experience possible after the development works are complete. So we can just quickly on this map show you. You can see Green Puff there. That's the closure is somewhere down in this lower section. So that, as we discussed, will be preserved. The Dark Forest Trail, I understand, is no longer exist, but it's going to be replaced with another trail called See the Light. And then the trails that connect to it. So I think this is Lower Grumpy Goose will be modified to connect to the new trail, and Moby Dick will be modified, rerouted, and renamed to Call Me Ishmael and connect to the new trail as well. The developer is also planning to, or it's already underway, building a 4-kilometer trail on the old Foch Road alignment to create a trail to Mosquito Lake on the valley bottom, which is part of the net gaming trails that the original agreement, I understand. So see if I can do this here while I talk. The use and access to recreational trails on private property is always going to be a challenge. Ultimately, the private landowner has ultimate authority to whether or not recreational access will be allowed on the trail. So let's see if I can pull this up. So there you guys can see the Village of Pemberton boundary there, nice dark font. And then we can pull up we can see the Smith layer shows partial ownership. So the red is all private property. The blue is a crown, I believe that's for the option lands. So you can see that a lot of recreational trails within the village boundaries, are within private property. So in the best case, the trails are permitted either informally or with right of ways. But unfortunately, the vast majority of them, I don't believe, do have any sort of legal protection. And now that's part of the report. I'll just stop sharing this and everyone's eyes. I think the village has an opportunity ahead of it with the OCP update to really rework or refine and update our policy framework around recreational trails. Since the previous OCP update in 2011, I think the term that comes to mind for me about recreational trails is their popularity has exploded. I know, it's hard to overstate. I feel like it's hard to overstate the importance of recreational trails in a community. So we're pretty excited for an opportunity to update our policy around recreational trails. The OCP update project hasn't progressed to a point where we're at that level of detail yet. However, the Nkukuma sub-area plan draft, which was released to the public, does have some preliminary, some draft statements around trails. which are worth exploring, and will probably be, we'll look at those as a beginning point for the OCP update. Most importantly, for this discussion, one of those sort of newer policy areas or policy statements we'd be looking to include is around, any trail or truck connections over private or strata property shall be secured for public use with a statutory right of way. But it includes things just like about formalizing that a necking and recreational trails and establishing exactly what that means. That concludes my report. I'm happy to take any questions or show the GIS again if you'd like.
This is not quite on that. The tangential details, that little, let's call it roughly a triangle, right triangle. Is that the extent of the development, or because I think it was blue above it and you said it was a crown option, and so.
This sounds like an opportunity.
Also, will the GIS, will that be publicly accessible?
Yes. Yes, very soon. I hope if we're talking about later this week, exactly the timelines when that will be.
But also, I want to put you on the spot and just, it's when you see it. There's so much information on that.
I will say that. Yeah, so where?
So I guess you had, like, on here, we had highlighted there was the land in which I guess the Sunstone development, we were looking at the specific part.
Yes.
Is that, I guess actually just the blue above it? Is that the extent of the development, like the land above that is, were you saying that's crown land?
Yes, exactly. So this is the extent of the private property that is known as the Sunstone development. And then beyond that, I understand that this property is owned by the Loa Nation.
Okay.
And I believe that this is also part of what they call the option lands. They have a right, but not an obligation to purchase those lands in the future.
Okay.
And I understand that the FLRD did a trails network master plan in 2020, which includes a great deal of about all the trails in this area as well. And from what I understand, reading that document, there is an agreement between the Loa Nation and the PVTA regarding access and use. So I don't know, that kind of falls sort of in the middle of the spectrum in terms of legal right to access, although it seems that the property owner is not going to enforce any kind of prohibition on use anytime soon, so.
Yeah, and the agreement was in an effort to legitimize as many of those trails as possible. And obviously to work with Liwat so that it was a respectful, comfortable.
Nice.
Yeah, thank you.
I like that.
We'll pass it on to Ms. Hughes, our GIS
Yeah, because
technician.
we've never seen that type of thing before, and it's really neat to have an overall look.
Okay, let me add one more layer for you. It's in here. Yeah. So this is the, I'm going to use my earphone, the OCP, the urban growth boundary. So that's the manual studies there. That's this sort of dash line there. You can see it, I'll turn it off and on so you can see it very clearly. So it's that dash line that just appeared.
You just did it again.
There we go. That one. And so that is established as the map A of the OCP, which sets out this is the area which can be developed. And unless if land is not within the urban development or urban growth boundary, it can't be developed until that boundary is expanded.
Okay.
So that sets an effective limit on development in the village until such time as it's that boundary is changed.
Okay.
No, if I might, that shows that area. Can you show the benchmark area?
Certainly.
Did you see where that can go beyond there?
Here's the.
If that's all right, man.
Sure, and then we'll go back to trails.
Yeah, so here we go. So there's the urban growth boundary off. And
Any other questions?
Can you post?
Thanks, Scott.
Thank you very much.
thank you.
It's helpful. That's a lot of clarity. Can I get a motion to receive, please? Councillor Craddock, seconded by Councillor Ramsden, any opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. Let's go adjourn committee of the whole, moved by Councillor Nightingale, seconded by Councillor Craddock, any opposed? Motion carries. I will reopen the regular council meeting. Are we still recording? Okay. And then I'll look for a motion to go in camera. Councillor Craddock, seconded by Councillor Ramsden, any opposed? Motion carries.